Hi everyone, welcome to Unit 2 on probability. This is our first of 3 lessons, so in this lesson we're just going to be kind of recapping what is probability. So probability has to do with things called random processes. So this is just a process where we know what can happen, but we don't know what will happen. So it's like we know the possible outcomes, but we don't know which one's going to happen. So it could be like flipping a coin. We know the outcomes are heads or tails, but we don't know which one it's going to be. Rolling a dice or drawing cards from a deck. Lots of different random processes. Those are just simple ones. I've already used this word, but an outcome of a random process is just a single possible result. So if you flip a coin, an outcome would be heads or tails. Rolling a die, an outcome would either be 1, 2, 3, 4. It's just the number that you roll. That's the outcome. Events are a little bit more complicated. Those are like sets of possible outcomes. So like rolling a die, each individual number is a single outcome, but say we want to know what is the probability of rolling an even number. So that combines 3 outcomes. Rolling an even is the outcome of either 2, 4, or 6. So that's called an event because it's combining a group of outcomes. Or it might be, if you're drawing cards from a deck, drawing an ace, because there's 4 different ways you could draw an ace. Each individual card would be an outcome, and then an event would be combining some of those into a group, or drawing a heart, or drawing a spade, drawing an even number, etc. Okay, and then kind of putting this all together, theoretical probability. This is the number of ways a particular event could possibly occur divided by the total number of equally likely outcomes. So we're going to look at examples of this below, but just some examples or some symbols. Usually we use a capital letter to represent an event, and then so if E is our event, P of E stands for the probability of that event. Okay, so let's look at some examples of theoretical probability to kind of flesh that idea out. But the main idea here is like number of ways your event could occur over the total number of possible outcomes. Okay, so for our example, we're going to say that we flip a coin 3 times in a row. What are all the possible outcomes of this process? So we have 3 coin flips. Okay, so we could have all heads. So it could be heads, heads, heads. Or we could have 2 heads and 1 tails. And here's the ways that could happen. We could have heads, heads, tails. Or we could have heads, tails, heads. Or we could have tails, heads, heads. Each of these strings of 3 letters, that's an outcome. This is a single possible result of this process. Okay, and now, so this is all the outcomes where I get 3 heads. This is all the outcomes where I get 2 heads and 1 tails. Now let's do 2 tails and 1 heads. So that's similar to this. We could have tails, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, tails. And then the last possible outcome would be all tails. So tails, tails, tails. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 total outcomes. Okay, so now we're going to find a probability. What is the probability of exactly 2 tails? So this is an event now. Exactly 2 tails. That can happen more than one way. So that's an event. So let's list all the ways that event could happen. Exactly 2 tails, that's this set of outcomes, right? We could have tails, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, or heads, tails, tails. Oops. So 3 ways. Okay, so we're going to use that to find the probability. Probability of exactly 2 tails equals the number of ways that can happen, which is 3, divided by the total number of possible outcomes, which was 8. So our probability is 3 out of 8. It's basically saying this can happen 3 ways out of 8 total possibilities. 3 out of 8. And that's it. That's all there is to finding a theoretical probability in general. Okay, let's do 2 more probabilities. So what if we said, what is the probability of at least, at least 2 tails? Instead of exactly 2 tails, at least 2 tails. So that means all of these count. So we still have tails, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, tails, but we can now count the 3 tails because this is at least 2, right? So tails, tails, tails also counts. So this can happen 4 ways. So our probability of at least 2 tails is the number of ways it can happen, which is 4, out of the total number of outcomes, which is 8. So 4 out of 8, and that actually simplifies to 1/2. So this is saying half the time you're going to get at least 2 tails. It's as likely as not. Or it's saying half of the possibilities involve at least 2 tails. Okay, one more. What is the probability of at least 1 head and at least 1 tail? So at least 1 of each. Okay, so heads, 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 that doesn't count. All of these work because they have a heads and a tail. So let's write those down. All of these work because they have a heads and a tail. Okay. But the 3 tails doesn't work because that doesn't have a heads and a tail. So we have 6 ways this could happen. So our probability, 1 of each, is going to be 6 ways out of 8 total. So 6 out of 8, or you can simplify that. They both divide by 2, so you could get 3 out of 4. So this is saying 3 out of 4 times, or 75% of the time, you're going to get at least 1 of each. All right, so that's just a very basic kind of overview of probability. And in our next 2 lessons, we're gonna just kind of explore 2 different facets of probability.